Sheriff Will Lotus let out a long breath as he turned onto his quiet suburban street. After a grueling shift, filled with reports, arrests, and the weight of responsibility, home was his sanctuary. His 2 kids were in the front yard, kicking a soccer ball back and forth, their laughter cutting through the still evening air. This, his family, his home, was the one thing that made the job worth it. He parked, stretching his sore muscles as he stepped out of his squad car. He could already taste the homemade dinner his wife had promised him. But just as he shut the door, a sharp, authoritative voice shattered the moment. "Will Lotus. You're under arrest." The tone was sharp, commanding, but the second Will turned around, he knew something was off. A blonde woman in a crisp black blazer stood at the edge of his driveway, holding up a pair of handcuffs. Behind her, 5 men stood in a loose formation, all dressed in business casual attire, each wearing a badge that looked cheap and unofficial. Will had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize a scam the moment he saw one. He folded his arms. "Mary Ellison." His tone was more annoyed than surprised. Mary's smirk widened. "Oh, so you do remember me." Unfortunately, he did. Mary had been a thorn in the community's side for years, running what she called a community order task force, a rogue HOA militia that harassed homeowners over fabricated rule violations. She had no real authority, no legal backing, just arrogance and a handful of goons dumb enough to enforce her nonsense. Will sighed. "What's the charge this time?" Mary raised her chin. "Violation of multiple HOA regulations. Your work vehicle has been parked in a residential driveway for 2 weeks, blatant disregard for community standards. Trash cans left out past 10 a.m. And," she gestured toward his backyard, "an unauthorized play structure." Will glanced at the small plastic slide near his kids and shook his head. "You're joking." "I don't joke about the law, Sheriff." Mary's voice dripped with mockery. She took a step closer, holding up the cuffs. "Now, put your hands behind your back." Will didn't move. He'd seen real threats before, gang leaders, armed criminals, violent offenders. Mary Ellison and her neighborhood enforcers didn't scare him. "Mary," he said, keeping his tone even, "you do realize HOA violations aren't criminal offenses, right? Even if these charges were real, you don't have the authority to arrest anyone." Mary's smirk didn't falter. "That's where you're wrong. The Real Police refuse to enforce order, so we're stepping up. Our community deserves better." Will chuckled, shaking his head. "You're not the law." Mary's eyes flashed with irritation. "I have just as much authority as you do." Will raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? Where'd you go to the academy?" Mary's face twitched. "I don't need a badge from some broken system to serve justice." The men behind her nodded in agreement, but Will could see doubt creeping in. Even they were starting to question what they'd signed up for. Will took a step forward. "Let me be real clear, Mary. What you're doing right now. This is a felony. Impersonating law enforcement, attempted unlawful detainment, those are crimes. You can either walk away, or I can arrest you for real." Mary's smirk finally cracked. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face, but she quickly masked it. "You're bluffing." Will reached for his radio. "Am I?" Mary's eyes darted between Will and her crew. She was losing control of the situation, and she knew it. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. "If you won't comply, we'll do this the hard way." She snapped her fingers. Her men stepped forward. Will's hand hovered near his belt, where his radio, and his gun, rested. He had no intention of drawing his weapon on a bunch of wannabe enforcers, but if they put hands on him, they were going to regret it. But before anyone could make a move, a familiar sound filled the air. Sirens. Will smiled. "Looks like real backups here." Mary's smirk faded the second she heard the sirens. The sound cut through the night like a warning bell, and her so-called officers shifted nervously. Will, on the other hand, allowed himself a small smile. "You hear that?" he said, glancing toward the street. "That's actual law enforcement." Mary's fingers twitched around the cuffs in her hand, but she held her ground. "This is harassment," she spat. "You can't use your buddies to intimidate me." Will scoffed. "Intimidate you? Mary, you showed up at my house trying to arrest me with a plastic badge and a power trip. You picked this fight." The flashing red and blue lights finally rounded the corner, and 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb. Doors swung open, and 3 uniformed officers stepped out. One of them, Deputy Carter, Will's longtime friend and partner, strode forward, his expression unreadable. "Will." Carter's eyes flicked to Mary and her crew. "You good?" Will nodded but didn't take his eyes off Mary. "Yeah. Just dealing with a neighborhood watch that thinks they're the FBI." Carter turned to Mary and crossed his arms. "Ma'am, is there a reason you're trying to detain an off-duty sheriff?" Mary lifted her chin, trying to maintain her bravado. "Yes, officer. Sheriff Lotus is in violation of multiple HOA regulations. He's parked a work vehicle in a residential driveway, his trash bins." Carter held up a hand, cutting her off. "I don't need a rundown of your made-up charges. What I do need is to see the credentials of you and your team." Mary hesitated. One of her men, a lanky guy with a nervous expression, reached for his badge, but before he could even present it, an officer behind Carter snatched it. He turned it over, examining it. "Sheriff," the officer called to Will, holding up the cheap piece of plastic. "This thing's not even metal. I could snap it in half." Will shook his head. "Sounds about right." Mary's face reddened. "This is a citizen's arrest." Carter cut her off again. "No, it's not. You're not citizens making a lawful arrest. You're cosplaying as law enforcement, and that's a crime." Mary's bravado cracked. I was only doing what needed to be done. This community needs order." Will sighed. "Mary, this community needs a lot of things. But you in charge isn't one of them." The squad car's headlights bathed the street in a harsh glow, and the tension reached its breaking point. Carter nodded at his officers. "Arrest them." The moment Carter gave the order, chaos erupted. Mary lunged backward, but there was nowhere to go. An officer grabbed her wrist, twisting it just enough to snap the cuffs onto one hand before she started shrieking. "You can't do this. I'm the law here," she screeched, kicking at the ground as the second cuff clicked into place behind her back. Meanwhile, her so-called officers didn't put up much of a fight. The moment real law enforcement moved in, the group crumbled. 2 of them raised their hands in surrender immediately, while the mustached man Will had taken down earlier muttered curses as he was cuffed. The lanky one tried to run. It was almost pathetic. He made it 3 steps before a deputy snagged the back of his blazer and yanked him to the ground. Will watched as one of the officers searched Mary, pulling a laminated, official, document from her pocket. The officer skimmed it before laughing. "You typed this up yourself?" Mary's face burned red. "That's an official community order task force warrant." Carter held it up, shaking his head. "Ma'am, this is literally a Word document." Will couldn't help but chuckle. "I think you just proved my point, Mary." Mary's eyes darted around, desperate for some way out. "I'll sue all of you. I'll take this to court. I'll have your jobs." Carter ignored her as he turned to Will. "You pressing charges?" Will exhaled, rubbing his temple. "She impersonated law enforcement, tried to detain me unlawfully, and has been harassing the entire neighborhood for months." "Yeah, I'm pressing charges." Carter nodded and signaled his officers. "Take them in." As Mary was dragged toward a squad car, she turned and snarled at Will. This isn't over, Lotus. You hear me? This isn't over. Will, finally free to enjoy the night, just smiled. Yeah, it is. The squad cars pulled away, taking Mary and her wannabe officers with them. The street fell quiet again, the flashing lights disappearing into the distance. Carter patted Will on the shoulder. I gotta say, I've seen some dumb criminals, but this? This is next level. Will laughed. You think this is bad? You should see the fine they tried to hit me with for my Christmas lights last year. Carter shook his head. Man, you need to move. Will looked at his house, his kids watching from the porch, and smiled. Nah. They need to move. And with that, Sheriff Will Lotus finally walked inside, ready to enjoy his well-earned night off. By the time Will stepped inside, the adrenaline had finally started to wear off. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the tension slowly drain from his body. His kids were still peeking through the curtains, wide-eyed, as his wife, Dana, stood in the kitchen, arms crossed. You couldn't even make it 5 minutes home without an arrest happening in our front yard, she asked, half amused, half exasperated. Will chuckled as he dropped his keys onto the counter. Not my fault. Mary Ellison decided to play sheriff tonight. Dana sighed. I heard the sirens. They finally arrest her. Will nodded, rubbing his jaw. Yeah. And her whole task force. Turns out impersonating law enforcement doesn't go over too well with actual law enforcement. Dana shook her head. I swear, this HOA is out of control. They started with letters about mailbox height, and now they're out here trying to arrest people. Will smirked. Gotta admit, that was a new one, even for me. His kids ran up, their excitement barely contained. Dad! Were they real police? His son, Jake, asked, eyes still wide. Nope, Will said, ruffling his hair. Just a bunch of people playing dress-up. Jake frowned. So, bad guys? Will thought about it. Not dangerous bad guys. Just really, really stupid ones. Dana leaned against the counter, eyeing him. What now? Will exhaled. Well, Mary's looking at multiple charges, impersonating an officer, unlawful detainment, harassment, resisting arrest. She's not getting out of this one. He gave her a wry smile. So I think it's safe to say she won't be patrolling the neighborhood anymore. Dana snorted. Good. Maybe now I can put the trash cans out without a surveillance team monitoring me. Will shook his head. This neighborhood, man. Dana walked over and kissed his cheek. Come on, Sheriff. Dinner's getting cold. For the first time that night, Will allowed himself to relax. He sat down with his family, finally able to enjoy his night without a fake cop trying to slap cuffs on him. Or so he thought. The next morning, Will was enjoying his coffee when his phone buzzed. It was Carter. You're gonna wanna hear this, Carter said, his voice carrying a mix of amusement and disbelief. Will took a sip of his coffee. Let me guess, Mary's already trying to post bail. Not just that, Carter said, chuckling. She's doubling down. She actually tried to argue that her community order task force has jurisdiction over the police department. Says her arrest of you was legitimate and that we were the ones interfering. Will nearly choked on his coffee. You're joking. Nope. She told the judge that you should be the one in cuffs. Will pinched the bridge of his nose. You cannot make this stuff up. Oh, and get this, she's already trying to recruit people from inside the jail. Talking about forming a detention unit to keep the inmates in check. Will groaned. Please tell me the judge shut that down immediately. Oh yeah, Carter said. Judge basically laughed her out of the courtroom. Denied her bail too, since she's a flight risk. Will finally allowed himself a genuine smile. Well, that's one problem solved. Carter laughed. For now. But something tells me Mary's not gonna let this go quietly. Will shook his head. Let her try. She's not gonna win this fight. As he hung up, he looked out the window at his peaceful, quiet street. For once, there were no rogue HOA enforcers, no fake badges, no ridiculous power plays. Just a normal morning. And he intended to keep it that way.